Because time is of the essence, we would like to start right on time this phenomenal panel, Scholars Roundtable on the Northwest Ordinance in our own day. And so I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly, and we can get this conversation started. So today we have 4 panelists. John Locke, who is the editor-in-chief of the Middle West Review, president of the Society and Study of the Midwestern Literature, and founding president of the Midwestern History Association. Then we also have Brian Schoen, who is associate director and associate professor here at The Ohio State University of the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. We also have Christopher Green, who is also a professor of history at the Chase Center. And Green was a professor of law and Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi School of Law before joining the Ohio State University at the Salmon P. Chase Center. And our other scholar who does not need any introduction, but she's definitely going to get one, is Annette Gordon-Reed. She's a historian and the Carl M. Loeb University professor at Harvard. She's the author of several books and has won over 16 book prizes, including the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize in history for her book, The Hemingses of Monticello. If you haven't read that book, you need to go get it and buy it. Most recently, Gordon-Reed released the New York Times bestseller on Juneteenth, telling the sweeping story of Juneteenth's integral importance to American history. Gordon-Reed is also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Humanities Media Medal, and so please join me in welcoming Annette to The Ohio State University. Let me sit down so we can start this panel. So we have a few questions to start this panel, and I think they're going to offer us a lot of food for conversation, discussion / dialogue, and maybe lead us in many directions. So here is the first question that I will pose to the panel. And you guys can all either address it or whoever wants to do it can go. So the first question is, what might the United States and North America more broadly have looked like had the Northwest Ordinance not been enacted?
Well, one of the obvious things is that slavery would have persisted much longer because in the interior of the continent, in places like Illinois and Indiana, the French presence still persisted and the French allowed slavery. And as we mentioned, it was put on the road to extinction by Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance. So that was a major difference. Also, it probably would have been controlled by some imperial power, whether it was the French or the British or whoever, unlike what happened under the ordinance when there was democratic practices mandated by the ordinance and the creation of new states that could govern themselves. I mean, so without the ordinance, the place would have been different for a significant much longer period of time.
Yeah, I guess it depends at what stage we're imagining the alt history branching off. So July 11th or something, just like lightning strikes, and so they're still in Philadelphia in secret doing the Constitution, but there just isn't a Northwest Ordinance. They haven't worked out that deal. At some point, they're going to come up with some kind of structure for the governments out west. But in the world where you don't get that, that influence on the Philadelphia Convention, well, there's certain aspects of the Constitution that you really wonder, are they going to be there? They might eventually come up with a system that allows Congress to ban slavery in the territories. They might eventually do that, but they're not going to have the same binding force and felt obligation to do that like they do in 1789. But Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, it's, one of the three big compromises with slavery says migration or importation of slaves into any of the states now existing can't be prohibited prior to 1808. The reason they have the now existing is because of Ohio, because it's not a state now existing. Congress is allowed to prohibit the importation of slaves into Ohio. If July 13th doesn't happen, they might, have a free importation of slaves nationwide until 1808. But which would be, that would be. Who knows? Does Lincoln happen if you don't establish free soil in the north of the Ohio?
That's a very interesting question, a very tough one, and I don't have much more to add than what they're saying here, is that the balkanization would be clear. It would have taken a longer time to be a nation if it hadn't been passed, because I think there would have been interference by imperial powers who still wanted a foothold on the North American continent, and it was really important to have it one thing, have some sense of continuity between British colonies and what was going west, and you wouldn't have that if there were other European powers still jockeying for power there, and slavery too. The whole picture with slavery would have been different. Having that ordinance there and a principle that an anti-slavery principle in that document and in that formulation was important to the rest of the country. It put people on notice that it was not necessarily a slave country, or not necessarily going to be a slave country.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'll add a little bit to it, and it comes back to one of Chris's points yesterday, which is there were definitely imperial interests, and there were also obviously indigenous interests in what was going to play out in this area. Part of what drove the Northwest Ordinance, I would argue, and also the Constitution that was unfolding at the same time, was that deep sense of anxiety, not just in the external forces, but in the reality that this could all fall apart from within. I mean, what was the model that was in most Americans' minds? It was Europe. And what had Europe been doing for much of the last 150-something years? Fighting, right? In massive armed conflict, which would continue for a while. And so figuring out a solution, as many of them saw it, that would help lessen the debt that had been incurred from the war, that would try to get everyone on the same page about how these Western lands, many of which had been claimed by states in the East, a solution that brought some order to what could have been a very, very, very chaotic, and still was, even after the ordinance, a chaotic situation, but one that at least there wasn't going to be Virginia fighting Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania fighting New York over who got to control some of those areas. Now, some of that had been settled before the ordinance, but I think it's important to kind of think about how great that concern was and how fragile many Americans felt their country could be at that time.
And I have a follow-up question on this, and I think it would offer a lot of us who work on anti-slavery and abolition. How can we consider or teach or engage with this idea that the Northwest Ordinance was standing as this anti-slavery principle, anti-slavery first, right? In the context of the drafters, and mind you, the drafters were two men, Nathan Dane and Rufus King from Massachusetts, I believe. And if I remember correctly, and you guys are more experts on this than I am, but the banning of slavery clause was thrown in at the last minute without consideration, right? So how can we teach about the Northwest Ordinance, setting this precedent, this principle for anti-slavery in the context of the challenging in the debates that emerged after its passing, when it wasn't actually something that the region actually wanted, if that makes sense. Do you guys, any thoughts on that? How can we teach about this with its contradictions?
I think we can teach about it by talking about, as someone in the last session mentioned, the importance of firsts. I know it can be overdone, but let's think about this. I mean, we're 250. 250 years ago is the Declaration of Independence. That's prior to the Northwest Ordinance. Declaration of Independence from a very large, powerful empire that was run by a king. That was extremely rare. That was the first time a country or a colony had pulled that off. This is prior to the French Revolution. This is prior to the Haitian Revolution. This is a major first. And this is, oddly, we haven't really talked about that very much here this weekend. The 250th relates to the Declaration. And this country entered a world of empires run by czars and kings. And as people mentioned here a minute ago, it was hard to pull off. And it was, we almost lost the Revolutionary War. It was highly contingent. It could have gone many different ways. So that's where I would start. Talk about this important first that completely changed the trajectory of world history. And maybe use that great book that came out about 10 years ago about the history of the American Declaration of Independence and how many times it gets repeated and used in other contexts. And, use that to highlight these revolutionary, unique, egalitarian principles that then get enshrined into law, into this critical statute passed in New York in 1787 and put in place civil liberties, the abolition of slavery, free exercise of religion, things that did not exist in the world of the 18th century, many places, very few places. Maybe the United States is the only place. So that's where I would start teaching it, and I think your students will turn on to that. We just sat through this session on how to get through to students and how to break through the din of electronic media and TikTok and whatever. That's one way to do it.
I love the story of the land speculators. I find that kind of oddly inspiring and wonderful. The idea that, so you have these, the people of Ohio don't make this decision because they don't exist, right? This is a statute that allows the people of Ohio largely, okay, not completely, but largely to define themselves or to be defined by the federal government as an anti-slavery people. And the fact that these big money guys say, hey, we can make more money if we allow people to go out and be part of a group that has been defined by the federal government as free soil people, I think that's fantastic. I think the fact that American capitalists see that they can actually make more money out of selling freedom, I mean, that's great. I mean, it's as great as, Walmart coming in and dropping a bunch of money so we can do public education about the Northwest Ordinance. If you've been to Disney World, the Century of Progress, I love, it's just transparently Walt Disney trying to tell everybody who watches it, you've got to keep the free enterprise system because we are going to come up with something awesome in the next 25 years. I just don't know what it is. Don't rest on your laurels and shut down the system. Keep the free enterprise system going. I love that. So I eat that like catnip. I would think, the students should eat it like catnip too. Not all do, but you set out the catnip and see if the cats come.
Well, you talk about that the issue of slavery is a contested one, as you're saying. There were different feelings about it. I mean, in the original part of the ordinance, the Jefferson ordinance has, that was one of his proposals, an anti-slavery proposal that didn't make it through. But there was no one thought about it, and we should let students know that this was something that people argued about and came to we ended up fighting about it. We couldn't resolve it legislatively or without violence, but from the very beginning, with Pennsylvania, Quakers, some people in Virginia, other folks wanted anti-slavery to be the position. So there was always a sentiment for that, and people need to know that it was not just one view about it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good things that have already been said. I think the challenge and the tension is that these ideals are there, and we know that they were not immediately implemented. And so there's multiple ways to look at that, and there's multiple perspectives on that. But it does strike me that something John said there, and I think it agrees with what Annette has said, really matters, is that those ideals are super important, right? If you were going to say, even if it's hedged and there's a lot of materialist, maybe not Chris's good speculators, maybe some of the less good speculators who are going to try to find ways around it to make sure that unfreedom and servitude continues. Even if that is a definite part of the story, and we've seen some wonderful illustrations of how that remained part of the story, that those ideals, if we can agree, they're all good, right? That many of these aspirational components of the Northwest Ordinance, for example, we all value and cherish. Then we have to not let them disappear from sight, so that we can understand better why it is and how it is and the mechanisms that were used to ultimately ensure that slavery was eventually abolished, right? And that the Midwest, when sectionalism and secession broke the country apart, the Midwest was on the side of freedom against what happened in the South, because had that not happened, imagine a very different story for what North America would look like. Even though it was, as one of the themes of this conference, it was messy. It didn't always bring out the better angels. It brought out some nasty angels too. But thankfully, in that instance, those ideals, even if not complete, prevailed. With the obvious and every we've all mentioned it, Native Americans did not benefit from these dimensions.
Excellent. So the second question, I think it's Annette's down her way too. What was the Northwest Ordinance's longer term legal legacy through the 19th century? Anyone can address it, but
You can, if you want to go.
I've written a whole bunch about this. So,
Well, you've written a whole bunch about it.
yeah. So, one thing that's striking, so we have the prohibition of slavery with a crime exception, okay? So, Article 6, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as aforesaid. This is much better and more clearly written than Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. The fugitive slave provision that they put into the Constitution a month and a half later, okay? Madison, I don't know how much of the detail you're detail people, right? So at the end, Gouverneur Morris comes back with the draft of the Constitution on September 12th, okay? And then they're just working on okay, so the Committee on Style was supposed to not make any changes, and then there's a bunch of this wonderfully fascinating stuff about whether Gouverneur Morris put in a semicolon to try to keep Maine from happening or West Virginia, just stuff like that. But there's this discussion about the wording of the fugitive slave provision, and Madison, 15 September. Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. The term legally was struck out, and under the laws thereof, inserted after the word state, in compliance with the wish of some who thought the term legal equivocal and favoring the idea that slavery was legal in a moral sense. Okay? 1819, when we banned slavery in the north of the 3630 line, we go back to the Northwest Ordinance provision with the proviso, legally claimed, legally reclaimed, which makes it very clear, and this is a provision supported by people who thought slavery was wrong, legally means something distinct from just. Okay? Same thing in the Wilmot Proviso, 1847. They copy the same language. And this is actually, I think this is a really important distinction about what the word law expresses. You can actually tell this in Article 3, again, even though it's abused and not really followed, the provision about the Native Americans. The utmost, so right after the great sentence that we quote all the time, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Yay. Next. And this is a great sentence. If the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians, their lands and property shall never be taken away from them without their consent, and in their property rights and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and preserving peace and friendship with them. So just and lawful, they explicitly say we want our wars, if we start them, to be lawful. So not just, executive nonsense of the sort we've had the last 50 years, quite regularly, but also just. Okay, so the fact that they say just and lawful in Article 3 and then lawful in Article 6 makes it very clear. They don't think slavery is just. These claims of fugitive and the right to fugitive re-enslavement, it's not the right thing to do. So I just think, some people like, the Philadelphia Miracle, it's written so well. There's a lot of stuff that's really written well. It's not written nearly as well as these provisions. I think is much more careful. And the fact that the Republican Party goes back to that language instead of this stuff thrown together at the last minute on September 15th, 1787. So that's more than you want. But the fact that law does not have a strongly moral component is a really important fact for understanding both the 13th Amendment, duly convicted, and the 14th Amendment, what due process of law means. It means legality, but it doesn't mean justice as such.
Well, it also conveys, I think it's important to convey the government's interest in justice, but also education, those kinds of things that establishes the government as taking an interest in equality. States should be equal. People should be educated, and this should all be done according to law. For law-minded people, that was really important to have this set forth, to know that as you moved across the country, they have an expectation that there would be the protection of government that promotes law. And it's not just a free-for-all. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on this evening about how that isn't something that we think about today, about how this process unfolded, but it was critical. It had to be, it's legal, even if it's not necessarily just.
Yeah, yesterday when when the governor was here and we went out, there were all these cameras, the only sentence I heard Governor DeWine say was, "Ohioans obey the law." So our self-conception of as a people of Ohio is we obey the law. And that's good. It's not always true.
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to answer this question.
You can still answer it, you know.
Well, I was just going to bring up, since Chris mentioned this provision about the Native Americans, in a way, when you take a step back, it's kind of interesting that it's even in there. I mean, they make a very strong gesture, as Annette says, toward justice and legality and some sort of fair process. Good faith is an important legal doctrine. It's just not a throwaway word. Mm-hmm. It means that you will sit down, talk reasonably, and come up with some exchange that both parties agree to. And down the road, there are many conclaves, many meetings where officials of the U.S. government sit down with tribes and try to come up with some sort of reasonable arrangement. Now, we all know it doesn't work out in detail, but they didn't have to do that. They could have just taken the land. And we're not talking about large numbers of people either. I looked this up at the break just so I could remember this correctly, but probably the most prominent historian of the Shawnee, the most important tribe around Ohio in these years, is Steve Warren at the University of Iowa, and he came up with a number of about 1,000 Shawnee in Ohio at the time of the Revolution. That's not very many people. I mean, these are lands. Much of Ohio was empty at this time, as Richard White explains in his book, The Middle Ground, because of these major Indian wars between the Iroquois and the interior tribes, the Great Lake tribes, however you want to describe it. So this is kind of open territory. But still, they take the time to put this provision in there to say, you know, we're going to have some sort of legal process in place to negotiate these land decisions and these issues of who will control the land legally. And I think I agree with Annette. That is a step forward. That is very aspirational. And I know it doesn't always work out in ways that we would find just in the year 2026. But this is a long time ago. And also remember, we're talking about the end of the Revolution, where a lot of tribes were fighting with the British. There's not a lot of goodwill toward some of these tribes by American troops and Americans living out on the frontier. And still they put this in. So I think that's remarkable when put in context.
And we don't have at this, in July 1787, we don't yet have a tribal commerce power supported by an executive branch that really exists and does anything. And it highlights, the fact that this doesn't have teeth yet highlights the need for what they're doing in Philadelphia. They've got to give a central authority, have Washington come in and say, look, we are going to try to negotiate and keep these kind of Western crazies from just exerting depredations on the natives. The Indian Non-Intercourse Act is a super important part of what, at least at official level of principle, the federal government's doing. It doesn't prevent the depredations, but at least they're looking like, at least they want to look like they're trying. So that's something.
Brian, do you want to take a shot, or should I?
As I said, I'm the only non-lawyer on the panel, so I'm going to be quiet.
All right, so I do have one more question before we open it up to questions from our teachers. So here it is. What one aspect of the Northwest Ordinance or its early implementations do you think students first encounter or they're encountering need to know?
Article 6. But we've covered it so much this weekend, I don't want to go through it again. But it's, I think, to a lot of students, it's remarkable that happened in 1787.
I probably agree that is one of the biggest and most important takeaways. That some states had taken action against slavery during the war, which were really important in the Northeast, but the West was seen with lots of different visions amongst speculators and settlers, and it was seen as the future of the country by many people, and so to make that decision was, again, with all the caveats that we've explored, was a pretty important and powerful statement. So
I would pick that too, but to pick a different one that I think I'd like to focus on is the equality of the states, that what is necessary for a Republican society. You couldn't have a Republican society with some states more equal than others. And this is not something we think about a lot, but now I guess we're thinking about it because we might have some more states, but that is a critical juncture for getting everybody to go along with the idea.
Yeah, we talked a little bit earlier about what's the textual root of this doctrine of equal footing among the states. I think it's just the word state. And you can draw an analogy between the word state and the word citizen. So there's a long tradition. Justice Thomas goes over a lot of this in his United States versus Valle Madero concurrence from 4 years ago. But to be a citizen is implicitly to be an equal citizen, at least defeasibly. Okay, sometimes there's differences between citizens that they don't get exactly the same rights because, one to commit a crime or something. States, to be a state in an empire that doesn't have the second-class structure that we complain so much about when Parliament only had representatives from Britain. If you're going to be in a regime that recognizes states as real states, you have to have some kind of equality. Okay, you get differences like Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, where it's only the states now existing that have certain rights. That's actually for the good of the future Ohio. But other things being equal, you have an equality among states, just like you have an equality among citizens. So as that principle gets to be embedded more in American law, I think America becomes a better version of itself.
It affects everything. People think about it and apply it in different contexts. They don't have to do with that specific thing, that this is just a value.
Excellent. Any other last thoughts?
I got this one quote. So the 13th Amendment drafting, 1864. So if you've seen Lincoln, sometimes I don't know, I kind of didn't realize how long the 13th Amendment took to ratify. I just sort of thought, well, I'd pick up a copy of the Constitution when I'm age 10 or something. 13th Amendment, 1865. Well, that's when the war ended. So they ended the war, they ended slavery. 1864, it's April 1864. And Charles Sumner, who is this kind of amazing senator from Massachusetts, but a little bit wild intellectually. Really a fascinating guy. But he wants to take language from French law and put it into the 13th Amendment, even though the Judiciary Committee had already decided, no, it's going to be Northwest Ordinance language. But Jacob Howard is my number one, clearest-headed, he explains himself most clearly during Reconstruction. If you have a choice of reading something by John Bingham, who drafts the 14th Amendment, or Jacob Howard, go with Howard. He will explain it almost certainly better. But he says, in April 1864, I wish as much as the senator from Massachusetts, Sumner, in making this amendment to use significant language. So he's like, we need to have this cool French language. Language that cannot be mistaken or misunderstood, but I prefer to dismiss all reference to French constitutions or French codes and go back to the good old Anglo-Saxon language employed by our fathers in the Ordinance of 1787. An expression which has been adjudicated upon repeatedly, which is perfectly well understood both by the public and by judicial tribunals, a phrase, I may say further, which is peculiarly near and dear to the people of the Northwestern Territory from whose soil slavery was excluded by it. That's how he's talking about it in 1864. There's the July 13th celebrations going on in the 1850s. They see it as part of who they are as a people.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all of the panelists. And now we're going to open it up to questions for our teachers. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1 and then 2. Yeah. Okay, I guess we'll start over there and then we'll come to you.
Okay, I'm not a teacher, high school teacher, as I was here yesterday. When we talk about Native Americans, the article and the Northwest Ordinance, now that I think about it, it sounds a lot like the Royal Proclamation of 1763 about indigenous land. Could it be inspired directly by that?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I bet there's a good legal analysis, a legislative history that someone explains that, but I don't know what it is.
I mean,
There might be members of the audience here who are a little more expert on some of that. Is there anyone who knows?
Yeah, this is the one aspect of the founding where I've done like research into into tribal commerce power, but it's definitely a response to the same problem. And so George III says, okay, just don't go over the Appalachians. Just don't do it. And more or less, the Indian Non-Intercourse Act says go across the Appalachians and buy things from the tribes if Washington says it's okay. So it's allowed with restrictions. It's a huge delegation to the executive branch. There's a bunch of questions about whether or not delegation is a thing based on those licenses, but it's definitely a response to the problem, which is like a huge problem, and it's the imperial question of what are we going to do? Are we going to let people just kind of wander off and set up their own societies, or are we going to try to control it? And what if they do terrible things to the people who are already living there?
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
So you've alluded to this, but I'm curious who has a little more information. We talked about how the Constitutional Convention and the Congress dealing with the Northwest Ordinance were pretty much concurrent. There were overlaps in time. So one of the questions that's natural for me to ask is, we know they were communicating. Where were the people overlaps and where was the connection between the Continental Congress and when it was later ratified by the Congress?
Well, one of the people who's involved with this, and Scott Britton alluded to him earlier, Manasseh Cutler, was doing a little bit of what we could call shuttle diplomacy between, and goes and hangs out with Ben Franklin and is awed by his garden. Yeah, I mean, I think there was correspondence, and there's not a lot not everything is written down in great clarity, but the belief was that Cutler was pulling the wheels on multiple levels and other correspondences that were happening. And then I think it's been, to your second question, if I understood it correctly, yeah, one of the first actions of the first Congress was to ratify the Northwest Ordinance under the new Constitution to make sure that its provisions would remain in effect under the new governing structure.
Yeah, Lincoln's Cooper Union address goes through like man by man of all the 39 people who ratify it and figures out like which of them were in New York when we did the Northwest Ordinance, which were in the first Congress, which were in the later Congress that did the Missouri Compromise. I mean, it's if I'm sure all of us who've read it are like, wow, this guy is this is Lincoln, and he's like doing a spreadsheet, like but he goes person by person, and it's like, wow, this is complicated. There are a lot of personalities. But yeah, so one of the earlier panels we did today talked a bit about just those interactions.
Thank you. Did you have?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Professor Gordon Reed, this question is for you and then any members of the panel who might add. I wonder if in chapter 27 of your brilliant work, Hemingses of Monticello, you wrote about Jefferson hosting the wives of tribal leaders at the White House, and that Louisa Adams is scandalized by Jefferson's fair treatment. And I wonder if the panel could speak to, even through a foreign relations lens, national security lens, the presence of women and family structures by a leader like Jefferson, and how that changes by the time that we get to maybe Indian removal a few decades later.
Well, I mean, they're not, I mean, he did this as a courtesy. I don't think I don't have any indication that he's negotiating with them, that they are. Although in some groups, women actually were the leaders. They made decisions. And I just don't know enough about that particular group to know what role the women would play. I included that because the primary reaction was not about a gender-based thing. It was a racially based thing. It's the idea, how do you insult white women by having these women here socially, when in fact they may have in fact been the ones who were the the real leaders in the society. So, yeah.
Do you want me to?
No,
Yeah, you're good. I mean, I guess as a historian, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, my understanding, and there's other people in this room who are far better to discuss Jefferson and Indian policy than me, but one of the challenges that Jefferson always confronted, both within the White House, was that his wife had passed away, and he did not have somebody who could do the entertaining that was quite common during that period. Secondly, though, he had a certain anthropology of Native American peoples that was gendered in the sense that he couldn't understand why it was that the women, as he saw it, had to do all the work, and the men, he thought, were kind of like doing this hunting stuff. And hunting in European culture was like, that's a recreation. And that was part of his whole theory of how Native Americans might be peaceably coerced into smaller plots of land, because he said if we can just keep the men at home doing the agricultural stuff, then the women would be able to have more kids because they're not doing so much labor. And it might mean that there's a chance of survival amongst those groups. And there was a lot of misunderstanding, a huge amount of cultural misunderstanding in those assumptions. And I don't know if any of that plays into what the story is. But again, if anybody has a better answer than mine, who's in the audience, come up and find her and tell her and correct any mistakes I may have made.
Mm-hmm. No, but that was definitely his idea, that they have more. He said, we have more children than they do, and it's because they follow the hunt and so forth. Doesn't explain why African American women have just as many children too, because they're certainly laboring. But he wouldn't have been inviting them there to have them participate as leaders, even though within their own group they may actually well have been. He may not have understood that they actually are the ones that they, in many groups, had a say in making decisions about politics and what the group actually did.
Yeah, Jefferson, there's a lot of things to criticize about the guy. I mean, but this is just sort of just charmingly bonkers theories. I mean, it's almost like Aristotle thinking men had more teeth than women. Like, didn't he ever check? This is life is a polymath. You have 15 minutes to put together a whole theory of sociology of stuff that, like, wow, that could have done with some more work.
And we have
Paul's been back there.
Yeah. So I think she raised her hands, and then Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Thank you all for being here. Question from a teaching perspective regarding curriculum and standards in Ohio, and looking at it from the perspective of the question that was raised earlier, the most important portion of the ordinance with respect to Article 6, being able to teach the history here in Ohio, and the fact that in order to counteract, if you will, Article 6, the Black Code, the Black laws that were put into place by one of the framers of the Northwest Ordinance here in Ohio, Edward Tiffin, who was one of the authors for that. How do you teach that in the classroom when you have high school and college students putting two and two together saying, okay, you've got Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance that prohibits slavery in Ohio and the Northwest Ordinance, but you also have these laws that have been enacted to keep those coming into this state in their place.
It's tough. It's tough particularly now because slavery is not, it's racially based, but after you've dealt with the issue of slavery, then you have to deal with the issue of race. And right now, there's a problem with that because everybody's scared to do that. So I don't know what you do other than use primary documents. And I thought that's what I typically said, that, when you're talking about Texas, and I said, how do you teach the history of Texas, the Republic of Texas, without the Constitution, which says that it promotes slavery and that African Americans can't move there? So can you not let students read the Constitution of Texas? And now maybe, yeah, maybe that's the answer. But realistically, in real life, in a perfect world, you would teach it just by showing it I mean, you would say it. You would give people primary documents. It's not a matter of interpretation. You're not making this up and saying that this happened and it didn't happen. But you show that there's an attitude about slavery. The attitude about slavery doesn't solve the problem of race, and you move forward with it. But right now, we're in a situation where people are frightened to say these kinds of things because they might lose funding or be harassed in other kinds of ways. It's sad. It's unfathomable, actually, as an American that I sit in advisory groups for museums, and everybody's saying, "Can we say this?" Never, in all the years that anybody, that ever come up. But now you have to watch your words, so it's not easy.
Yeah, the primary text, talking about like principles and actions that don't really fit with them. I mean, classic text to go to is King's speech at the March on Washington. We've come here to cash a check, and all too frequently, America's checks have come back marked insufficient funds. You still have to look at the check to see what it says, right? So you have, I think the folks who don't want just cynical acid about America have a point. They want attention drawn to our ideals as well as, failing to live up to them. But you got to talk about the ideals. You got to talk about failing to live up to them. You got to be like Martin Luther King. You got to say, we got to check. We got these principles of equality. We got these principles of liberty. We got these principles of justice and lawfulness. But we also have a history of not living up to them. And you gotta tell both stories. You can't teach each of them. You can't teach either of them saying it's the exclusive thing. And I think that's the real. I mean, if you're trying to understand what's behind legislation that says, "Hey, don't just give cynical acid about America," I think that's how I would interpret it. Also explain what the principles are. Read the primary documents. See these glorious truths that we articulate, even though we don't live up to them.
Quick comment to add on to what Annette said, and then why I really raised my hand. The other thing to assign, of course, would be the Texas Secession Convention statement, which says we came into this union to have slavery forever. And we are leaving because a man's been elected president who thinks that it should be on the road to ultimate extinction. So we are leaving because slavery should be here forever. And the same thing in South Carolina. I once gave a talk at University of South Carolina. I had everybody coming into the room, handed the South Carolina Declaration of the Causes of Secession, and this room full of mostly South Carolinians. I said, "How many of you have ancestors who fought for the Confederacy?" 100 hands go up. I said, "Well, let's read this together." And it was like, hitting a mirror with a pebble and watching the glass shatter, because they started saying, "Why didn't we know this? Why didn't they teach this in our schools?" I said, "Well, you figure that out." But but the real reason I wanted to raise my hand is because the notion that it took a long time for the 13th Amendment to pass, which one of the speakers seemed shocked by, is simply not true. The amendment passes the House on January 31st, 1865, and it's ratified in the middle of December of 1865. Given simply the difficulty of communication and everything else, and the fact that you have to wait for state legislatures to come into session in the fall, perhaps, before they can even ratify it, less than 11 and a half months is I think, a pretty quick ratification. The reason it took so long is because there were just enough Democrats in the old Congress to prevent getting the 2/3 majority you needed in the Congress to send the amendment on to the states. After the 1864 election, it became clear that the Republicans were going to do this, and Lincoln urged the Congress to do it now. Why are you waiting? And enough Democrats kind of didn't show up for the vote, so the Republicans could pass it. And of
Yeah,
course,
this
as
is-
we know, that was when the Republican Party, was the great opponent of slavery.
Yeah, this is just the miseducation of 8-year-old me that I didn't know it was basically the 1864 platform of the Republican Party saying, "Hey, we passed this in the Senate. Give us a few more representatives, and we'll pass it in the House." I actually think it became law. I have this quirky view, the loyal denominator view. When how many states are in the denominator of Article 5 when they proposed this January 1865? Can the South say no? Or do you only need 3/4 of the loyal states? So you get to 19 of 25 in July 1865. For the 14th Amendment, if you adopt a similar view, it becomes law in February 1867. But that's a quirky view. That's the quirky green view. But lots of people during Reconstruction had it too.
Thank you, because time is of the essence, and we're going to try to finish at 4 or shortly thereafter. Maybe one more question or 2 more questions.
Thank you to the panel for being here. I'm not a teacher. I've been a law professor, and I'm an attorney. And so you put 4 attorneys in a room, you can get 5 opinions. But I've got to ask, and thank you. I've spent more time thinking about the Northwest Ordinance this weekend than I have in the last 57 years. So Section 14, Article 3, specifically talking about Indians. And I kind of like what our neighbors to the north refer to them as the First Nations people. But regarding that clause where it talks about that their property rights and liberties shall never be invaded or disturbed unless, quote, in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress, end quote. Really, my question is, for any of you, but particularly the lawyers, is that to be read in the conjunctive or the disjunctive? In other words, did the territorial governor and the judges of the Northwest Territory have the authority to say, well, Congress has authorized a war, but we don't think it's just and lawful, therefore we're not going to take away their property or their rights? I'm just kind of curious. And do you know, was there ever any court cases or controversies that invoked that part of Article 3? I'm curious. Thank you.
I would read that not as giving authority to local people to countermand Congress, but a promise by Congress.
what it was gonna
because
do.
this is from Congress. Congress is saying, we're going to do our best to keep people from waging war unless we've authorized it. And we're not going to authorize it unless it's just. That's how I would read it. But I mean, it's conjunctive.
Yeah. I think that's right. They wouldn't give that authority over to the locals to do.
Great. 1 and 2. 2 more questions. 1 and 2. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Croft. I'm a recovering attorney, and I came here for fun this weekend.
I like that.
This is my idea of fun. I want to pull on something that Professor Gordon Reed said, which is that identifying the equal footing of the states is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Northwest Ordinance. Just simple question. Did this become a template for all other states to join the Union, or were there variations after that for you, but for
That's the
everybody
template.
else?
Yeah, I think all the admissions acts say, Kentucky comes in on an equal footing with all the earlier states, Mississippi. I mean, all the admission acts have that preambulatory language.
And there is a weird thing that happens in a period that I know not as much about in the 20th century, where it becomes less common after Hawaii for places like Puerto Rico and other territories to come in as states. Now that's partly, as I understand it, due to some of the choices of those residents who may not want to have a certain type of relationship. But somebody was talking about this yesterday. Why is it that after this one thing working, is it like we're at 100? We can't go over 100. 100's the magic number. We're not going to go above that. But there is a little bit of an odd dynamic there.
Yeah,
and it's going to give us some insight.
The template that it creates, once you have 60,000 inhabitants, then you can petition to become states. Persists. So the template that it creates, that once you have 60,000 inhabitants, persists, but it only persists until New Mexico attempts to petition, and that happens sometime in the middle of the 19th century. And the problem with New Mexicans, as you might imagine, is that they're not Protestant, they're not white, and they're not English speakers. And so other states continue to be ushered in, and meanwhile, New Mexico continues to ask and ask and ask and ask and waits for half a century or more until it's finally admitted. It both creates this template that is honored. It's nowhere inscribed in law that once you automatically reach 60,000 inhabitants, you're entitled to become a state. You can simply request it, but it is observed. It does become a norm until you have a state that begins to challenge, I think, kind of assumptions about who should belong to the American Republic.
Yeah, the insular cases from 1901, 1902, there's I think one later in 1922. Justice Gorsuch gives some really, really powerful criticisms in his concurrence in Madera from 2022. I joined an amicus brief saying that people born in American Samoa, they ought to get birthright citizenship too. Yeah, it's like America when it decides we can be an empire. We can leave these folks in second-class status. I mean, the Philippines, nobody thinks they're going to become a state between 1898 and 1946, but they've got to win World War II, help us win World War II before they get independent. There's some jar that jars with the American self-conception.
All right, thank you. And our last question.
I have a question for each of the panelists, or maybe one or two of you can respond. What ideas or discussions have you heard across the past 2 days that have changed your perspectives? We have a lot of experts in this space. And so as we prepare to leave, what idea or ideas or discussions have you heard over the past 2 days that have changed your perspective of the Northwest Ordinance?
Well, I came after all of this stuff.
That's off the hook for this.
So I'm off the hook for this one.
Yeah, so I mean, I remember reading early drafts of Annie's stuff when she was looking at St. Louis freedom suits, and I'm extraordinarily encouraged to think, wow, that kind of method of finding out stuff. There really is a lot of unbelievably interesting, disturbing information in these court records, and I am encouraged that people are able to read that handwriting well enough. I mean, it is hard reading these old documents, but I'm encouraged that the more OCR stuff comes along, the more we just get this stuff digitized, get it in databases, let everybody around the world see it. We'll be able to tell stories like that more effectively. The archives are getting louder, and they're big, and they really there's an awful lot you can learn, and more every day.
I just offer one thought. This is something that Chris reminded me of as we were sitting down here, and Paul kind of brought up the whole idea of South Carolina's statement during secession. If you read the Mississippi statement on secession, and this is a great way to end a discussion about the importance of the Northwest Ordinance, one of the first things they say when they secede from the Union is that cursed Northwest Ordinance has done us so much damage and caused so much chaos in the Republic because it's this hammer for beating down the slave power, that this is one of the reasons we're leaving the Union, because of that cursed Northwest Ordinance that banned slavery. So that's 5 stars for the Northwest Ordinance.
Yeah, I hesitate to change that. I mean, I think, of course, I've worked in this field, and so I've read a lot of the works and familiar with some of the stuff that's been presented. But I agree, like with Chris, in the sense that there's a lot of these, like discovering all these stories that I didn't know, and realizing that there's the means to do it, with the caveat that very few people read cursive and are trained to read cursive. So I'm not sure that that's always going to become available to us. So those of you who can do it now and transcribe it into print and text so it can be digitized so that future generations can find all of these things. Or teach cursive. That's cool too. But yeah, I think that's been one of my takeaways. And I also love the economics because I do political economy, and so I was one of those like geeking out over Susan's presentation about wheat and how it's harder to get from Havana to New Orleans than New Orleans to Havana. That was stuff I didn't really know about, and thinking about geography as being significant was fun. So.
Well, so I'll say this to conclude. Two things that I heard and I learned that I want to take away. We need to teach cursive. I think it's very important because those records are not easy. And the second thing is that there's clearly a lot more to learn about and from the Northwest Ordinance. So we just need to keep talking about it and dialoguing and bringing more lenses to, learn more and teach more on it and with it. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you so much.
Okay, I do have a few housekeeping things I need to tell people about. First of all, if you are headed over to the Fawcett Center for tonight's keynote by Annette Gordon-Reed, there are still some parking passes out there for you to pick up that you can put on your dashboard. So that's one important announcement. If you are a teacher who is seeking the certification credits for this, then you can pick those up also at the registration table outside. And if you are a teacher and you are interested, there will be a small private chance to engage with Dr. Gordon Reed in room 302 after this session. So we're gonna, those of you who are teachers can follow up on some of the questions that you may have with Annette, who's been very gracious with her time. And thank you again, Annette. It's been fantastic. Thanks for joining us. So thank you all for coming here. We hope to see you at the keynote tonight, which begins at 7:30. Did I forget anything, Chris, Todd?